So welcome to the Steve and Scott Show, and I am Steve, and I'm with Optimity Advisors. We work with Fortune 500 companies to help them choose technologies, and for their technology, specifically in the DAM and metadata space. And I had the pleasure of working with Airbnb to create and refine their global taxonomy with this gentleman here, Scott.
Hi, I'm Scott Davis, and I'm with Airbnb. I am a digital content manager and part of the digital asset management team. In particular, I help out with our creative department and the tool that we work on. And we won't have many damn puns at this event because we have self-branded. So what I work on is called the Digital Asset Repository You Love, also known as Daryl. So for us, Daryl is kind of like the tool that everybody goes to. And this platform is quite robust. So it's an operations tool, and it's responsible for the workflows of a lot of the product imagery that happens across all of Airbnb's brands, product websites. But it's also very malleable and flexible to be the sandbox for all these sort of creative things that are done in-house and in collaboration with just partners from just globally. And it has a lot of challenges, but also a lot of flexibility to it. And when we get that many assets in, myself with a relatively modest team, but with tons of producers and with lots of engineers, we do everything we can to try to make sense of what comes in, and then having it so we can redistribute it, whether for product or for marketing needs, because it is sort of positioned within the company as this central touch point for so many things. So we had an explosion of data and then absolutely needed to get people to help us to govern everything that we had and just even understanding what state we were in.
Yep. So when we came in to help them, they had, over 20,000 different fields of metadata, which we were able to refine and bring down to around 8,000 or 9,000. Now, 9,000 pieces of metadata, still quite a bit of fields to govern, but if you look at it, it's a huge step in the right direction. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, Scott, is buy-in. And the question here is, executive and user buy-in is vitally important. Can you share with us across, we talked to a lot of people, across the board, which people did you choose to involve when we were creating the global taxonomy?
Yeah, for the Daryl tool, it was kind of like originally brought into Airbnb to be just sort of a place for final assets, kind of a traditional archive and marketing library of sorts. But then it quickly became sort of this operations. For Buyin, we already had within the creative department, I'll recap very briefly, that the people who initially wanted to implement this tool, so it's already kind of for everything that they want to have accomplished, this is where it is. So they already had investment of money and kind of foresight for knowing everything that could happen to get assets in securely, and then where people can then work with them and then distribute them later. And then we had to include, of course, people from product and other places where instead of building a new tool in-house, they just wanted to leverage our Daryl. So when we were going to do this taxonomy project, of course, they wanted to be involved, because when you have keywords that are entered by people for marketing needs, where does that overlap or become different from things that happen on a product page? Like when you're going to Airbnb and you're looking for a listing, you can use a word like that would make sense for finding something, but it's not quite the same for marketing. And then for within the company, we have just thousands of users just all over, all the offices who use the tool. So we identified like the main creators and people who use use Daryl all the time to get their input on how do you search? Do you feel that there's enough keywords, no keywords, keywords that give you incorrect results? Where's the balance of precision and recall? when you're going into our library and just trying to identify all those things from the key people who are contributing to the feeds, as well as people who are just using it.
So the global taxonomy, this is something I didn't realize when I went to Airbnb. I just thought they were, well, Airbnb, the home share type of thing that we all know. But there is a lot of other branded products that they have. They have experiences. They have their own magazine, which you may have seen in airports. They are now getting into video documentaries. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about the diversity, but the specific question is, when you have so many different departments and different products, how did you approach them to try and create a global taxonomy that would work across all these really disparate and sometimes different products?
Yeah, I'll kind of give you the cliched answer for Airbnb. Kind of has this vision of what we call the magical stay, and that is for anything that happens across, with Airbnb, you're going to stay at a listing, you're going to book an experience. Almost all of our content is, in a way, it's part of like the Airbnb family, or it's something that you can actually book. So when you just kind of know what's your lodestar, what's your central point of everything trickling down, you can then start to create, your branches and and all the kind of the extensions of your metadata tree. And some of that stuff is what, basically would be a keyword on the product page, or it's the subject matter of our magazines, or it's the way we identify our hosts, our guests, all the different things that happen. But it's just sort of part of like that whole like kind of main umbrella. Oh, but what we wanted to have was basically a cohesive vision where for words that basically became like kind of things that would come up all over the place, just being able to identify that, hey, the words that seem to repeat in all different places, that shouldn't be necessarily keywords that are just sort of like free text level, but also kind of these are parts of like larger class identifications. And in what we had to work with and why we had so many keywords was that in our library, we had already assets that were migrated in from legacy collections, also things that had been kind of built up from just all the importing that happened from stock photography, from photographers who had their own sort of like, keywords of their own varieties. So we were at sort of this critical point in terms of the collection where we had just thousands and thousands of like ungoverned and almost unknown and at times misleading keywords. So we needed to have like a very thorough kind of look through of what holistically made sense in the patterns of us as a business, of all like kind of the way departments were kind of broken out and the people who would want to get things versus the kind of, the metadata that we had in there, either deliberately in some respects by our marketing people and things, or things that were just incidentally there because it tagged along with like, a file import.
That's great. We do have a question from the audience. It says, what metadata tagging framework did you use across rooms, experiences, etc.?
For us, a lot of it is informed by kind of like what sort of things do we promote, as Airbnb as a business. So an example would be experiences and how there's lots of classifications. You have food experiences, art and culture, history and whatnot. So then you would just basically start to think like what it makes sense for people when they're going to our webpage. And then and a lot of that we were able to glean from interviews with our high-end users, plus just all the recommendations of what people thought this is what makes sense. And we just have like more or less, it just gets down to the point of when you're working in our tool, when you get search results, what would make sense is having like a filter and then nesting filters where you have your super like kind of higher level type and then the subclasses and where do those overlap and where does that become like, exclusive and whatnot. And then it's just like, just testing it. You just create a test environment, you put it in and see, do you get good results or do you get overwhelming results? Just trying it out.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Scott. Let's see what we have next. Success criteria. So we consider the consolidation exercise extremely successful based on the reduction in size that we mentioned earlier. But I guess, you know what, let me ask it a little differently than it says here, but would you have, do you consider it successful? And if so, what do you think contributed to the success of the project?
Yeah, it was super enlightening because our tool, we had imported in just just millions of images. We're at the point now where we have about 20 million photographs, 500,000 videos, and just tens of thousands of folders. And a lot of those things were just brought in from all sorts of different sources, as well as just what's been built up over time, just as an operations platform. And being able to finally hear everybody who's been contributing to our tool, this was really the first time we just sat down and got to hear them explain, this is what they expect to get out of it. Because we've just been trying to work as fast as we can to get it live on the web page, to get it out there to the people who they know sort of what went in, and they can kind of track it along the way. So their discovery was pretty easy. But if we were then to reconsider, how would this just become something that's searched and found by somebody who just started yesterday at Airbnb, who doesn't have all of that institutional knowledge? Those groups could then say, this is what these words mean to us versus what those words would mean to somebody else. And then you just start to see the patterns, you get to see the redundancy, and you also get to see all the synonyms. So you could just start to break down so many words to become just one core search term. And then that's just a lot of the refinement, you could say, was in that respect.
Great. So here's another question from the audience. You mentioned that you have a small team. They were wondering specifically, what is the size of your team? And maybe you could talk about, who makes up your team, and do you work with any other departments, or is it just your team that handles all of the assets?
Yeah, well, for our Daryl team, I'm just part of about 5 people. We have a few full-time and a few contractors, and we're able to borrow engineering talent that's dedicated towards a lot of the things we do for the focus of our creative team. However, for the operations aspect of how the Daryl tool is utilized with APIs and whatnot to just become this huge operations thing, there's then entirely dedicated imagery and production teams who they plug into our tool, but they self-service themselves. And in some respects, they just have their own domain within our entire platform. And as much as people think that I'm an admin and a super user and I should know everything, there are just elements of the tool where I don't really know what's going on. I just know things come in, stuff happens, and I can pull up something with a particular bit of an attribute, but then I'll have to defer to that team because until the asset hits what I understand to be the final retouched, rights locked down, publishable state, everything in between is a mystery box to me. So I'm just a representative of a very large operation going on.
And your team is also responsible not just for the assets, but like we were talking earlier, if anyone has a problem, right? You also are the admins of the system, and you also, I imagine, train as well.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Well, we have a thing where we have some training documents, but I also host weekly office hours, and we just have Slack channels that are dedicated for every single department that we have to service. So their questions are always going to be very different from what other people know, and their errors may be things that don't affect other people. So there's just no need to just openly broadcast that some API is causing a problem for a group of people in Germany when that has nothing to do or is going to influence the work of people in other places. So it's just a lot about communication, transparency, and just having those key stakeholders know how to get a hold of you.
That's great. So another question from the audience. Do you currently use automated tagging, or AI?
Our tool does have some built-in kind of auto-tagging, but we just haven't had it completely conform yet to, say, the revised taxonomy we have. And we do have kind of teed up, we like to implement really soon, after we did this exercise to kind of, really make a solid controlled vocabulary, to use some machine learning tools and have that basically because they basically do our entire collection for the most part. Not everything, because 20 million assets is quite a bit, and not all of it is meant to be functional. But everything that's relevant that we've identified, we will get that machine learning to do a lot of like kind of situational tagging and just sort of like visual stuff, and then also pump in a lot of product information, like listing information and whatnot.
Yeah, and even before we got on site, they had already thought about this and had a roadmap that was planned out of different phases. And they knew that their first phase was to establish, which it should always be, right, to establish your global taxonomy. That's that's your foundation to which you can build everything else upon. And so that's, yeah, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. And the next phase, in fact, is their AI.
Yeah, and at times, like, you kind of would hope, is everything perfect and linear? And of course, it's not the case like that. I mean,
Right.
and like, as much as I love to think like the world could just be Tetris, it is just going to be more like you hear like an orchestra as they're slowly tuning together. Everything will fall in place, and then you'll finally have like kind of that harmony, and everything will just sort of magically be in the right place together. And I hope we're there soon.
Yeah. Yeah, and keep the questions coming. These are great, because again, I'd rather answer your questions than just a bunch of mine. So we've got a couple more here. Do you have any tips for metadata tagging when it comes specifically to videos and video assets?
I think earlier today in one of the other rooms where they had talked about video, that there is just technology out there that could crawl through your video and then give you time-based sort of like keyword information, as well as like pulling out dialogue perhaps. And then if that can get included in the search engines of your tool, definitely like leverage that. Because with our art department, there has been where we just don't have all those tools finalized in place, where you will just for a special project just use that resource ad hoc to get a transcript, or if it's in a foreign language, getting a translated transcript of something that was originally in Spanish or in French. And I would just encourage meet up with the vendors or kind of look into what was recommended earlier.
All right, this is a really good question. I don't know if I know the answer to this. I'm sure we covered it at one point, but so pre-Daryl, how did you deal with pre-existing assets when you brought your dam on board?
Oh, well, I wasn't there for pre-Daryl, so I can't speak to that too much. But I do know that the legacy platforms, it was an era very much of somebody would send in emails, or it was that era of just people had their rogue collections on Box and what have you.
Right.
So there was a lot of like kind of high risk but good faith that people were just doing things correctly. And now we're in a completely different world with our tool has all the asset rights management you would hope for, and controlled distribution, authorization steps, and everybody has to go through gatekeepers if they want to use an image for any use case scenario externally.
Yeah, that's great. I hope we have some questions on governance, but if not, I'll make some up, because you guys do have really successful and good governance. So during this, looking back on the project itself, what would you have done differently?
I think that when we approached the library and was thinking about the content, we were very much focused on just the visual identifying markers of everything in there. And perhaps we should actually would have leaned in a bit more into thinking about our listings, our experiences. These things did have dollar tags and price tag information, because our platform isn't necessarily designed to be like a PIM system. In previous jobs, I worked in e-commerce, and so I'm very much accustomed to the idea. You have your SKU number and all these other values like that, and there could just be a search case scenario where somebody wants to promote something, but it fits within a certain value range. And that wasn't really something that we kind of talked too much about when we did our thing, but we were mostly thinking, because most of our users, everything is very visual, and you could also say, a lot of the advertising is supposed to be kind of removed from the price tag. It's just the brand and the feel and everything about wanting to kind of go into the product. And then you choose your economic options later.
Great. And this, by the way, is their offices, which of all the companies I've gone to, they have some of the most beautiful offices that I've seen. These are their meeting rooms that you're looking at. Each are decorated in a different way, in a different theme, to represent a different area where you can, go to Airbnbs. And they're decorated through contests that they have internally, and either, a person recommends what it should be, or a team recommends, and they pick the best one, and they give them a budget, and they decorate the room. And sometimes it works out really well, and other times it's a little rough, but it's they're all beautiful. So anyway, sorry, little diversion there, but I just wonderful office.
It's a fun place to be. Come visit.
And this is the Barbie Dream House. I don't know if you saw this. This was a promotion they just recently did, where they had this mansion that they painted pink and made it look like the Barbie Dream House, and you could rent it out. I think it was $40 a night or $50. It was really inexpensive because it was part of a marketing promotion. But anyway, it's about success. Have you seen any marketed improvement from this exercise you performed so far, and how do you measure success?
Well, for starters, we were just able to slash out and cancel just a ton of keywords that were just redundant and not, necessary for the collection. Going through this as well, because we have yet to really implement all of kind of the refinements that have happened. That's going to be part of more of a machine learning kind of tagging sort of project that's queued up for later in the year. So that's when we know we'll have all of those exact kind of returns. But for here and now, I mean, at least we have just knowing all the different teams and how they envision the way the company is marked up and described. This exercise brought everybody together into rooms who normally wouldn't meet otherwise. It was always kind of more a transactional discussion of how do we get this just to there to get it live. But now we get to really address the collection and have more of that cohesive vision of us being together. And in a way, doing this exercise has basically created what would be our governance group, and we just know who is involved, who participated, who's invested in seeing all of this work beyond after we implement everything. So a lot of that stuff was just glorious to have happen.
Right. Great. Here's a question from the audience. What's next for Daryl? And we talked a little bit about AI, but what else? What do you see moving forward, and what are your key priorities?
For us in Daryl, what we would love to see is just a lot more, just having the assets described better and knowing more about kind of their situation with just, I guess the short answer would be self-servicing, just letting people self-service, because for the size of our company and how quickly people want to work, as long as they know they can find what they need, that means they don't trigger a reference library sort of search request. They're able to get to what they want. And just having more of that sort of information available and having more keywords to just help people, because sometimes our rights statements, it reads like legalese because that's what we have to put in there with the mandate of our legal team, and just helping people being able to just do more stuff on their own and not feeling that we always have to hold their hands, because we want to grant our users as much autonomy as possible and hope that they can have confidence in just doing things and seeing it through. Fantastic.
What is the minimum number of metadata tags you could use? And I think maybe what they're asking is, do you have a minimal mandatory set of tags? And if that's not what you meant, then please speak up. But I think that's what.
No, we have, I would say, if there was going to be a modicum of information, it would be geographical, just kind of knowing where in the world something is. And then for a lot of our campaigns and kind of our marketing programs, they have code words and tags and things like that. And that's stuff that could be embedded in an asset, but not necessarily doesn't appear in free search and what have you. So and we have a system of just kind of adding, more or less, if you can see an image, it means it's been retouched. It's had kind of that scrutiny and all that stuff going on with it. So to say you needed more metadata, just the bare minimum would just be can it be used? So,
right. And do you require when people on upload or when they submit to have a certain number of pieces of metadata, or is that all on you and your team to tag everything properly?
For the stuff that gets ingested, I mean, a lot of it is just you're working with marketing teams, so they've already created a marketing brief. There's a lot of stuff that happens before anything even goes into production. So you already have information about creators, photographers, post-production agencies, where in the world is this thing taking place, who are the producers, directors, and people involved with it. Because at sort of like a higher level, the folders that contain all these assets, we insert all of that information so we can just inherit down directly to the imagery itself. And then when you have like your assets, your photography, your video, your artwork, and things that go along with it, you can then get into the granularities of explaining that this is like a certain codec, or this is a certain orientation for an image, or which platform is it intended for, if it's going to be Instagram versus Twitter versus Facebook and so forth. And for doing doing those last bits, we've created our ideal workflow of when people kind of propose, these are keywords we would want. These are perhaps new sort of things, that's because it's a new style of business, and this is how they're going to try to expect to find it. But then we hope with the machine learning tool that can just also go back and then check everything and just fill in if you needed to include that it's a pink mansion or something and there's a beach. And if we forgot to say that, but we did say it was the Malibu Dream House, perhaps.
Right.
Things like that.
Great. Well, Scott, you're fascinating, and I have a million more questions, and there's a few questions we didn't get to, and I apologize, but Scott will be here afterwards if you'd like to ask him directly. But let's have a round of applause for Scott. Thank you so much for joining us. It was great.